Welcome to NCSA 2020 Virtual.
Hi, my name is Autumn Mary Pryor. I am a senior in the Department of Sociology at Indiana University Bloomington. And today I'm going to be presenting my thesis project on entrances, exits, and experiences of queer homelessness. So, first off, some context. I wanted to do a project where we would be addressing a specific problem in the local area. And so, doing some research on homelessness in the area of study. The 2019 Point in Time survey stated that there were 380 people counted, 7 people identified as transgender, although sexual orientation was not recorded. So we don't actually have a good idea of how many LGBTQ people experiencing homelessness there are in the local area. But we can make a rough estimate based on estimates of LGBTQ prevalence among youth experiencing homelessness, which is what much of the research has focused on. And a variety of studies have shown that between 29 to 40% of youth experiencing homelessness identify as LGBTQ. So if there are any comparable numbers among the adult population, that is a significant amount of people. And as I'll show here, on queer homelessness among youth, they are specifically significantly at more risk for rates of mental illness, violence and sexual victimization, and substance use. So this population experiences specific vulnerabilities that are not present in the general population experiencing homelessness. Much of these obstacles have to do with shelters and resource utilization. So studies in the past by Coolhart and Brown and Abramovich have shown that LGBTQ youth often do not feel safe in the shelter environment because of cisgenderism and heterosexism. Often these environments can be very full of stress, lots of loudness, lots of toxically masculine behavior. And so this can lead people to isolate and feel like they cannot use these things. And this is especially a problem among transgender youth who are experiencing homelessness because frequently they are placed in shelters where they're according to their gender assigned at birth. And so this creates a significant conflict psychologically and materially, where they're in a space that is not affirming to who they are and that actually may be placing them in danger. And so queer youth who are experiencing homelessness employ a variety of strategies to survive this environment. These include resilience and resistance. So previous studies have talked about it as paving pathways through the pain. And so people will talk about feeling more in touch with themselves and feeling like they are better able to advocate and be themselves and say what they need out of service agencies. And then as this relates to identity formation and identity work, David Snow in the past has talked about distancing, embracement, and storytelling as strategies of identity formation among the general population experiencing homelessness. And distancing is where folks will separate themselves from, quote unquote, the bad homeless, who are often blamed for the stigma and the prejudice among the public, rather than some of the societal conditions that are producing this. Others use embracement, so embracing their new identity, and this is related to resilience. And then storytelling is a common method of keeping your own identity in this. So, having just a general like narrative of your life is often a technique used to resist this. And so for the purposes of this study, we wanted to investigate the experiences of queer adults experiencing homelessness, because the literature largely focuses on youth, and so there is a significant knowledge gap in terms of the specific things that adults who are experiencing homelessness need and their experiences. So for the purposes of this study, we've defined homelessness according to the definitions from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development for literal homelessness. And so this means someone who is lacking a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence, including public or private place not meant for human habitation. So this could include squatting or sleeping on the streets. It also includes staying in a vehicle overnight, as well as publicly or privately operated shelters designed to provide temporary living arrangements. And so these would be your homeless shelters, transitional housing arrangements that are meant to provide just a brief respite from staying on the streets. And also exiting an institution where they resided for 90 days or less, in which they were previously in a shelter or experiencing homelessness on the streets. And so this would be somebody who is exiting a psychiatric facility or who was previously incarcerated. In defining queer and LGBTQ+, I use these two terms interchangeably, mostly just to provide variety in the language. For the purposes of this study, and this is a definition, so queer as a term is a reclaimed slur, and coming with that, it is a word with contested meanings. However, one of the most common is simply, defining an identification that is not cisgender and heterosexual. So this would be lesbian people, gay people, bisexual, asexual, pansexual people. And then in terms of gender expression, that would be transgender, genderqueer, non-binary, two-spirit, really anything that is not cisgender and heterosexual. So the problem that we're facing is we have a local at-risk population that we really know very little about, and there's little extant research on LGBTQ+ adults experiencing homelessness. And so the goal here is to fill in the knowledge gaps, center these people's experiences, and figure out how best to meet their needs and how best for social scientists to develop theory around this. So the guiding questions of the study were: how does stigma shape the access and interactions of LGBTQ adults experiencing homelessness? How does identity and community develop among LGBTQ adults experiencing homelessness? And how can this research improve the condition of its subjects and help remedy the stigma that they face? So the methodology for this was, we did semi-structured in-depth interviews lasting approximately 1 hour. And these consisted of developing a housing timeline of their living arrangements over the past year, and this was developed based on the residential timeline follow-back inventory developed by other scholars of homelessness. And so what we did here was we started on the day of the interview and moved backward, charting where they had lived in time, going back a whole year, and making specific note of the entrances and exits from homelessness that these people experienced. And then we moved on to open-ended questions on service agency use, interactions with staff, homelessness and wider community, and as well as the desired changes that they wanted to see in the shelter system and in service agencies in general. Eligibility and recruitment consisted of anybody who is over 18 years of age, so adults, legal adults. The person must identify as anything other than cisgender and heterosexual. Yeah. They must have experienced homelessness at any point in the past year for any amount of time. not be currently institutionalized. And then in order to recruit participants, flyers were distributed at service agencies and posted at high foot traffic public spaces, including libraries, high foot traffic streets, parks, and other various spots around town. And then subjects were asked to mention the study to anyone they knew who might be eligible in order to create a snowball sample. And a lot of the methodology for this was based in grounded theory. And this was developed by Barney Glaser and Anselm Strauss in 1967, and then later modified by Kathy Charmez for social constructionism in 2006. And basically, this is a methodology for developing theory directly from data rather than applying theories to data. And so this was a good methodology for an exploratory study because, really we're just trying to find out what's happening and how we can best understand these experiences. And so what we're doing is theorizing directly from the narratives of lived experience. And so results of the study, participants reported exits from homelessness that reflected the literature on the general homeless population, while entrances into homelessness were more unique. They reported intersecting stigmas that led to isolation and discrimination. They employed various strategies to manage stigmatization, and the desired changes that they had were the creation of safe spaces, LGBTQ and homeless representation among staff, and targeted programs specifically for this community. So the demographics of the participants who responded, we had 8 total participants between 30 to 64 years of age with an average age of 47.1. 3 participants were cisgender women, 3 were cisgender men, 1 was a gender fluid person, and 1 was a non-binary person. 3 people identified as gay or lesbian, 2 identified as bisexual, 1 as pansexual, 1 as sapphic, which is a gender-neutral term alternative to lesbian, and 1 identified as abstinent. And then 7 of the participants were white or Caucasian, and 1 was Native American. Participants reported entrances into homelessness that revolved around job loss, so losing your source of income and no longer being able to pay rent. Family conflict, and this included people who were kicked out of home because of their sexuality or gender identity, people who were kicked out of home just because of conflicts related around money or finances, and then 1 other person was kicked out of home because of conflict around chronic illness. Unsafe living conditions were also a cause for entering into homelessness. So people who were living around domestic violence, drug use, who simply felt that they could no longer, who felt that they were more safe entering into homelessness than they were in the place that they were living at the time. 1 person entered into homelessness because of an accidental fire, and then 2 people entered into homelessness because of abuse coming from the people who own the property. 1 person reported that after they began a homosexual relationship, their landlord started harassing them, and they felt that they could no longer be in that environment and be safe. And then another person reported that their landlord had actually stolen their rent and some of their possessions, and they lacked the resources to pursue legal action and ended up having to enter into homelessness after that. Exits were more closely related to what the literature had to say. Most commonly, this was having a social support network, so friends or family who could provide housing or support for entering into service programs or finding their own place. Recent employment was also a significant means of exiting from homelessness. As recent employment means that people now have an income and can pay rent. And 1 person reported that they had found stable housing after entering into a transitional housing program. And so, unfortunately, many of the participants were still living in the shelter system at the time of the interview. And so the exits that they experienced from homelessness were temporary, and they often attributed this to a lack of affordable housing, and histories of trauma. One person talked about, being out on their own since they were 16, and simply, the needs that they have to survive prevent them from really having the life skills that they need to, have a place on their own stably. So this is what David said. In reality, going through the problems I'm going through as an early child from 16 until now, I've had to struggle and raise myself. So there's some things in life I don't know and things that I'm still learning. So it's been hard to get a place and afford one by myself and then cope with the problems and then have to learn everything, the responsibilities, what I need to do, and how to go about it. And so David actually decided to start working for a traveling company that provided housing as an alternative to staying on the streets. Experiences of stigma. Subjects reported multiple overlapping stigmas centered around housing status, sexuality, gender expression, addiction, disability, and criminal history. And they reported avoiding certain spaces because of this anticipated stigma. So the specific intersection of homelessness and queer identity means that these folks are often further isolated and feel like they can't actually be open about themselves and talk about the totality of their experience for fear of stigma from staff. One person said that they had heard staff say the old homophobic phrase, God didn't make Adam and Steve, he made Adam and Eve. Others reported seeing other more openly queer people being harassed by other people experiencing homelessness as well as staff. And so this led to a situation where many folks felt like they had to hide their identity in order to attain access or retain access to services. And so one person, Calvin, who was a bisexual man, told me that he hadn't been open about his sexuality. Quote, I've been more open with you than anybody I've talked to since I've been down here, to be honest with you. And so these intersecting stigmas create situations where there is a unique oppression that people are experiencing that is not currently being addressed by service agencies. And this can lead to both explicit and implicit discrimination. Some explicit I talked about earlier. Most commonly, though, participants described more subtle interactions where they weren't necessarily sure that they had been explicitly discriminated against, but did feel like their identity had something to do with the way that they were treated. And so Caroline, who was a person who is a queer identified person, would talk about seeing other people experience this. So saying, quote, a lot of the times they'll take the person, the straight person's side. Like, let's say I said, you stole from me. Well, they don't know who to believe. We're both in the house. Who stole from who? She'll take the side of the person that would not be gay. A number of people reported this having conflicts with other residents and feeling like they weren't having their feelings respected because of what they figured was their identity. Experiences of community. Many people reported feeling a tight-knit community among people experiencing homelessness. Caroline would later go on to say, we call each other family. That's our street family. And a lot of this was built around common struggle and mutual assistance. So people who would, go out, try to help people get what they need. Barb, who was experiencing chronic illness, talked about how one group would take the money that they had from panhandling and give it to her so that she could get some of the stuff that she needed. However, this was not a universal experience among queer people experiencing homelessness. Others felt that they did not experience any community, ostracized from the community of people experiencing homelessness because of their sexuality or gender expression, and then ostracized from any kind of queer community because of their housing status. One person, Joseph, reported that after he had entered into homelessness, he had lost all of his friends who were part of the gay community. Others felt like they could not go to certain queer gathering spaces because of their homeless status and the stigma around that. Changes that they desired. They want participants generally most commonly desired targeted programs specifically for queer people experiencing homelessness. A common theme was specific experiences of trauma and isolation that queer people experience that is not being addressed by service agencies as they are. So targeted programs specifically to address those needs, as well as the creation of safe spaces where people who are experiencing homelessness can be open about their identity without fear of stigmatization or discrimination or ostracization from the community. And one thing that participants valued was staff who themselves identified as queer, feeling like they could talk to them about their issues, or who themselves have experienced homelessness, and so having perspective on what specifically to do to best meet these needs. And so implications for theory and practice from these results show that intersectionality is a significant part of the LGBTQ homeless experience. Anticipated stigma and identity management are new avenues for research for social scientists. And in general, social scientists and service agencies should work to center queer experiences in their new developments. And so in the process of examining the results, theory was developed from this. And so as I analyzed the intersecting stigmas, I used Kimberly William Crenshaw's theory of intersectionality, which was originally based around the specific oppression that Black women experience in the workforce. And developments of this as a general social sciences practice generally talk about how various forms of stigmatization are mechanisms of power. And so, as David would say, he has nowhere to go. He feels like he has to hide his identity. And so he goes to this one service agency that he doesn't feel comfortable at because he feels like he has nowhere else to go. And so this serves to isolate the population and make them vulnerable, and so specifically able to generate capital and profit from them. And so the intersection of sexuality, gender, ability, and criminal history with housing status produces specific oppressions, which intersectionality can help further explain. However, the racial homogeneity of the sample severely limits a full account of intersectionality because the most salient and visible stigmatized identity is race. And so there can't be a full accounting of intersectional stigma without interviewing racialized persons who themselves are queer and experiencing homelessness. Identity and anticipated stigma. So oftentimes participants reported the anticipation of stigma as much of a barrier as enacted stigma. And so one way to do this, or to remedy this, would be to specifically have non-discrimination policies on queer identity and gender expression, and the creation of safe spaces to remedy the anticipated stigma. Because if somebody feels like they can't even access a service agency, then that's a significant problem. More research should be done on strategies of identity management and implications for service provision and queer scholarship. What this means for queer scholarship in terms of how people navigate being a queer person in a cisgender, heterosexist, patriarchal world, and how these people might be hidden in the general homeless population and better serve this community. And in general, service agencies and social scientists need to be centering queer experience in their future research on queer homelessness, developing programs that specifically address these needs, hiring staff who have experiences with homelessness or themselves with queer identity, And another flaw in this research specifically was that most of the subjects were in the shelter system at the time of the interview, and so the so-called hidden homeless population, people who are couch surfing or who generally just aren't accessible through the shelter system, whether because of stigmatization or fear. And so one way to remedy this would be to more consistently utilize snowball sampling and also have agencies specifically refer people to the study. And so generally, more exploratory research needs to be done on the experiences of queer people who are homeless, because this still is a very vulnerable population. And as this specific study does fill in some of the knowledge gaps and provides new and intriguing avenues of inquiry, there still is a lot of work that needs to be done in order to best meet the needs and listen to the experiences of this population. And so here are some of the resources that I cited. And yes, thank you so much. This has been Autumn Pryor from IU Sociology. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my presentation. Stay safe out there in this pandemic, and you know, the general hope is that this research can help better social scientists understand this phenomenon and help service agencies serve this population. So yeah, thank you.